February 1917. Northern France. The Somme sector. 0400 hours. The trench stretches like a scar across frozen mud, its walls slick with frost and the residue of gas attacks that never fully dissipate. Private Thomas Hargrove crouches in a fire bay, his breath visible in the darkness, his hands wrapped around a broken entrenching tool. The wooden handle has snapped clean through, leaving him with nothing but the steel blade and a 6-inch stub. Around him, men sleep in shifts, huddled against duckboards that sink into the mire with every step. The silence is not peaceful. It is a silence of exhaustion, of men who have learned that rest is temporary and death is patient. Hargrove does not sleep. He stares at the broken spade in his hands, turning it over, feeling the weight of the blade, the rough edge where the handle sheared away. In another man's hands, this would be refused, something to discard in the next supply dumped. But Hargrove is not another man. Before the war, Thomas Hargrove worked in Sheffield, in the steel mills that fed Britain's industrial hunger. He was not a foreman or an engineer, not someone whose name appeared on blueprints or production reports. He was a grinder, a man who spent 12-hour shifts shaping raw metal into tools, sharpening blades, smoothing rough edges until they gleamed. His father had worked the same job, and his grandfather before that, a lineage of men who understood that metal has memory, that it responds to pressure and heat in predictable ways, that a blade is not just steel but geometry, angle, and purpose. Hargrove learned to read metal the way other men read books, to see in a rough casting the finished tool it would become. He learned patience, precision, and the value of small adjustments. A fraction of a degree in the grinding angle could mean the difference between a blade that held its edge and one that shattered under stress. These lessons stayed with him when he enlisted in 1915, when the mills sent their men to the front and the forges fell silent. The Western Front does not care about precision. It is a landscape of chaos, where artillery shells erase entire platoons in seconds, where men drown in mud, where the careful craftsmanship of peacetime becomes irrelevant in the face of industrial slaughter. Hargrove arrived in France with a belief that skill mattered, that attention to detail could save lives. He was assigned to the engineers, not because of his mill work, but because he was strong and could dig. The engineers dug trenches, strung wire, repaired duckboards, and dragged wounded men through mud when the stretcher-bearers could not reach them. It was brutal, anonymous work, and Hargrove did it without complaint. But he watched. He observed the patterns of the war, the rhythms of bombardment and counterattack, the small behaviors that separated survivors from casualties. And he noticed the snipers. German snipers were not random killers. They were methodical, trained, patient. They did not fire wildly into the trenches. They waited for targets of value, officers consulting maps, runners carrying messages, engineers repairing wire in the open. They worked in pairs or teams, rotating positions, never staying in one spot long enough to be located by counter-snipers. British doctrine called for smoke screens, rapid movement, and indirect fire to suppress sniper activity, but these measures were reactive, expensive in ammunition, and often ineffective. The snipers adapted. They learned the British schedules, the times when working parties moved into no man's land, the moments when periscopes rose above the parapet. They became ghosts, invisible until the moment they fired, and by then it was too late. Hargrove's unit lost 3 men in a single week to sniper fire, not in dramatic charges or trench raids, but in quiet moments, a corporal checking the wire at dawn, a signaller adjusting a field telephone, a sapper repairing a drainage sump. Each death was precise, clinical, a single shot that left no time for cover or response. The third death was different. The man was Corporal Daniels, a friend from Sheffield who had worked 2 furnaces down from Hargrove in the mills. They had enlisted together, traveled to France on the same transport, shared the same dugout for 18 months. Daniels was careful, disciplined, never took unnecessary risks. On the morning of February 9th, he climbed out of the trench to inspect a section of wire that had been cut during the night, probably by a German patrol. He moved low, used a crater for cover, kept his helmet below the skyline. The shot came from 700 yards, from a position no one had identified, no one had even suspected. Daniels died instantly, a bullet through the temple, his body slumped against the wire he had been checking. It took the stretcher-bearers 4 hours to retrieve him, and by then the sniper had moved. Hargrove watched the retrieval from the fire bay, watched them drag Daniels back through the mud, and something inside him shifted. This was not random. This was not the chaos of bombardment or the luck of a shell landing in the wrong place. This was a problem, a tactical problem, and problems had solutions. That night, Hargrove sat in the dugout with a broken spade across his knees. The blade was standard issue, carbon steel, 12 inches long, 6 inches wide at the base, tapering to a rounded point. The surface was dull, coated with rust and dried mud. He scraped the mud away with his thumb, revealing the steel beneath. It was not polished, but it had a faint sheen, the kind of reflection that came from wear rather than finish. Hargrove thought about sunlight, about angles, about the way light behaved when it struck metal. In the mills, he had worked with furnaces that radiated heat so intense it was visible, a shimmering distortion in the air. He had learned to gauge temperature by the color of the glow, to know when steel was ready to shape by the way it reflected firelight. Light was predictable. It followed rules. If you knew the angle of incidence, you could predict the angle of reflection. If you controlled the surface, you controlled where the light went. The idea came slowly, not in a flash of insight, but as a gradual assembly of observations. German snipers used optical sights, scopes that magnified their targets and made long-range precision possible. Those scopes were made of glass, and glass reflected light. On a cloudy day, the reflection was negligible, lost in the diffuse gray light of the western front. But on a clear morning, when the sun rose low in the east and its light raked across no man's land at a shallow angle, the scopes became mirrors. For a fraction of a second, when a sniper adjusted his aim or shifted position, the lens caught the sunlight and flashed. It was a tiny glint, barely visible, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But Hargrove had spent years watching sparks fly from grinding wheels, tracking the reflection of molten metal, learning to see light in motion. He knew that if the sniper's scope could reflect light, then something else could reflect it back. Something simple. Something that would not draw attention. Something like a broken spade. He began to work. The dugout was lit by a single candle stub, its flame guttering in the draught from the trench entrance. Hargrove laid the blade flat on a wooden crate and used a file from his pack to smooth the surface, removing rust and pitting, exposing clean steel. The work was slow, methodical, the rasp of the file a steady rhythm in the darkness. Other men slept or wrote letters or cleaned rifles, but no one paid attention to Hargrove. He was just another engineer, tinkering with equipment, killing time. When the surface was smooth, he searched his pack for something reflective, something that would catch light without being obvious. He found a tin of boot polish, the kind issued to every soldier. It lit a thin circle of stamped metal. He cut a small section from the lid using his trench knife, a piece roughly the size of a shilling, and polished it until it gleamed. Then he affixed it to the center of the spade blade using wire and a dab of adhesive from a field repair kit. The result was crude but functional, a dull steel blade with a bright center spot, invisible in shadow but brilliant in direct light. The next morning, before dawn, Hargrove climbed out of the trench. The ground was frozen, the mud hard enough to walk on without sinking, and the sky was clear, a rare gift in the winter of 1917. He moved carefully, staying low, using shell craters for cover, dragging the spade behind him. 50 yards from the British line, he found a suitable crater, its lip high enough to provide concealment, its position offering a clear view of the German trenches 600 yards distant. He planted the spade at the edge of the crater, angling the blade so that it faced east toward the rising sun. The angle was critical, too steep, and the light would reflect harmlessly into the sky. Too shallow, and it would scatter across the ground. Hargrove adjusted the blade by degrees, using rocks and frozen mud to wedge it in place, until he was satisfied. Then he crawled back to the British line and waited. The sun rose at 06:15, a cold white disk that climbed slowly above the horizon. Its light spread across no man's land, turning frost into diamonds, casting long shadows from every shell hole and strand of wire. Hargrove watched through a periscope, his hand steady on the wooden frame, his breath held. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. The spade reflected light, a faint shimmer in the distance, but there was no response from the German lines. Then, at 06:27, something flashed. It was brief, a pinpoint of light 200 yards south of Hargrove's spade, gone almost before his eye could register it. But it had been there. A scope, a lens, a sniper adjusting his position to track the reflection. Hargrove marked the location in his mind, a shallow crater near a destroyed pillbox, and waited. 30 seconds later, the flash came again, brighter this time, more sustained. The sniper had settled into position, his scope trained on the strange reflection in no man's land, trying to determine if it was a threat or an anomaly. Hargrove did not move. He counted the seconds, mapped the exact position, and then climbed down to find help. Hargrove found Sergeant McKee in the command dugout, a veteran whose skepticism was carved into every line of his weathered face. When Hargrove explained what he had seen, McKee's expression remained flat, unimpressed. The sergeant had heard too many theories from soldiers who thought they understood the patterns of war. But something in Hargrove's quiet certainty made McKee pause. He agreed to send word to the battalion sniper section. By 0700 hours, Lance Corporal Fenton arrived, a thin man with pale eyes and a pattern 1914 rifle fitted with a telescopic scope. Fenton was not friendly. He listened to Hargrove's description without expression, then set up his rifle on a sandbag rest and peered through the scope. 20 minutes passed in silence. Then the German sniper moved, just a fraction, a small adjustment to follow the fading morning light. Fenton's rifle cracked once. 600 yards away, the German slumped forward. Fenton worked the bolt, lowered his rifle, and walked away without a word. The first kill was credited to Fenton in the battalion records. Hargrove's name appeared nowhere. Over the next week, Hargrove refined his method. He realized one Spade was insufficient. German snipers operated across hundreds of yards of front, and a single reflective marker could only cover a narrow arc. He needed multiple markers, each positioned to provoke different fields of fire. He collected broken spades from other engineers, men happy to exchange damaged tools for fresh replacements. He polished each blade, attached reflective patches cut from tin cans and mess kit lids, and planted them across no man's land in a deliberate grid. Each marker was placed at dawn and removed at dusk to avoid detection by German patrols. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. Hargrove moved alone through the frozen wasteland, crawling through wire and around shell craters, always aware that a single careless movement would draw fire. But he was methodical, patient, and lucky he was never spotted. The results were immediate and dramatic. On February 14th, 3 German snipers were eliminated within 20 minutes of sunrise, all guided by Hargrove's markers. On February 16th, 4 more were killed. By February 20th, German sniper activity in the sector had dropped 70%. Runners crossed no man's land without being shot. Engineers repaired wire in daylight. Officers consulted maps openly on the fire step. The change was so pronounced that divisional intelligence sent a captain to investigate. The young officer interviewed Hargrove, took detailed notes, nodded politely, and departed. His report was filed with a recommendation for further study, but the recommendation was never acted upon. The method was too irregular, too dependent on individual initiative, too far outside the boundaries of established doctrine. It required understanding of optics and geometry uncommon among infantry, and it demanded repeated exposure to danger that no officer could officially endorse. The report disappeared into the archives, and the technique remained Hargrove's own. But soldiers talk. Word spread through the informal networks that bind armies together, the conversations in dugouts and aid stations, the letters passed between units. Engineers in adjacent sectors heard about the broken Spade markers and the sudden drop in casualties. Some dismiss it as luck or exaggeration. Others attempted replication with varying success. A few pragmatic officers, men who valued results over regulations, quietly encouraged their engineers to experiment. By March, variations of Hargrove's technique were being used in half a dozen locations along the British line. The men who used it did not know Hargrove's name. They called it the Spade trick, or the glint trap, or simply the marker method. It spread through demonstration and imitation, never formalized, never written into official doctrine, existing in the gray zone between approved tactics and field improvisation. The Germans noticed. Their intelligence officers pieced together fragments from survivor interviews, reports of strange reflections in no man's land, British snipers firing with unnatural accuracy at dawn. The German response was predictable. They adapted. Snipers received orders to avoid firing during the first hour after sunrise. Optical equipment was fitted with glare hoods and anti-reflective coatings. Positions rotated more frequently, never occupied for consecutive days. These countermeasures reduced German casualties but also reduced effectiveness. A sniper, constrained by time restrictions and equipment modifications, operates at diminished capacity. The innovation forced adaptation, and adaptation consumed resources. Artillery was expended on suspected marker locations. Supply chains were burdened with modified equipment. Training protocols were revised. Hargrove broken Spade had imposed costs that rippled through the German sniper corps, invisible but measurable. On March 21st, the pattern broke. Hargrove planted a marker at dawn as he had done dozens of times, but as he crawled back toward British lines, a shell landed in the crater behind him. It was not random fire. It was a ranging shot, deliberate and targeted. The Germans had spotted him. A second shell landed closer, then a third. Shrapnel screamed through the air as Hargrove pressed himself into the frozen mud, his heart hammering. The barrage lasted 3 minutes, a concentrated storm that churned the ground into smoking chaos. When silence returned, Hargrove was alive but shaken. He crawled the remaining distance and collapsed on the fire step, hands trembling. Sergeant Mackay found him an hour later and told him to stop planting markers, that the risk was no longer worth the reward. Hargrove nodded agreement. It was a lie. That night, Hargrove modified his approach. Instead of placing markers at dawn, he planted them during hours of darkness, working by starlight, accepting reduced precision for increased safety. The markers were cruder, their effectiveness diminished, but they still functioned. Over the following week, 3 more German snipers were eliminated. Then, on March 28th, everything changed. The Germans launched a massive pre-dawn artillery barrage, 6 hours of sustained bombardment that obliterated trenches and buried entire platoons. It was a prelude to their spring offensive, a final gamble before American reinforcements could tip the balance. Hargrove survived because he was deep underground in a reinforced dugout, pressed against sandbags with 20 other men while the surface world disintegrated. When they emerged, the trench line was unrecognizable. Fire steps were gone, parapets flattened, landmarks erased. Bodies lay scattered across cratered wasteland. The engineers were ordered to immediate repairs. There was no time for markers or theories or careful innovation. There was only desperate work, hauling sandbags and stringing wire before the German infantry attacked. The assault came at dusk, waves of field-gray figures advancing through smoke and shell fire. The British line held through rifle volleys, grenades, and hand-to-hand fighting that lasted 4 hours. When the Germans finally withdrew, half of Hargrove's platoon was dead or wounded. Sergeant Mackay died from shrapnel through the chest. Lieutenant Grave was evacuated with severe wounds. The command structure collapsed, survivors absorbed into reconstituted units mixed with fresh reinforcements who had never seen combat. Hargrove became just another anonymous face in a new platoon, his innovation forgotten in the chaos of reorganization. But the method survived. In April, a British staff officer reviewing casualty statistics noticed an anomaly. In sectors where improvised optical markers had been used, sniper-related deaths had dropped 60%. The correlation was undeniable. The officer, a major with engineering background, recognized potential and ordered a formal study. A team spent 3 weeks interviewing soldiers, documenting techniques, analyzing results. Their report, filed in May, recommended adoption of optical use as standard counter-sniper tactics. It included diagrams, specification for reflective surfaces, guidelines for placement angles. The report was approved and distributed to training schools. By summer, the technique was being taught to recruits, refined and formalized, stripped of improvised origins. The men who learned it never heard the name Thomas Hargrove. They were told it was a tactical innovation developed by staff officers, tested and proven effective. The broken Spade became a manufactured device, a stamped metal disc on a telescoping rod, issued from supply depots alongside standard equipment. Hargrove learned about this in August, in a convalescent hospital in England. He had been wounded in May, shrapnel through his left shoulder that severed tendons and fractured bone. The injury was not fatal but ended his combat service. While recovering, another patient showed him a training manual that included a section on counter-sniper tactics using optical lures, complete with diagrams and instructions. Hargrove read it twice, slowly. The technique was his, the theory was his, but his name appeared nowhere. The manual credited the innovation to divisional intelligence and staff development. He felt no anger, only quiet resignation. This was how institutions functioned. They absorbed individual contributions, refined them, redistributed them as collective knowledge. In that transformation, the individual ceased to exist. Hargrove was discharged in November 1917, classified medically unfit for further service. His shoulder never fully healed, leaving him unable to perform the heavy labor required in steel mills. He found work as a tool inspector, a position demanding precision rather than strength. He returned to Sheffield, to familiar streets that felt strange after France, and began rebuilding a civilian life. He married in 1919, fathered 2 children, worked steadily through the Depression, retired in 1952. He spoke rarely about the war. When asked, he described himself as an engineer who dug trenches and repaired wire, said it was hard but he survived. He never mentioned markers or snipers or the 14 men eliminated in 20 minutes. His wife sensed he had done something significant, something he would not discuss, because she saw how he stared at reflections, at sunlight on metal, at the geometry of shadows. But she did not press, and he did not volunteer. The technique, however, endured and evolved. Through the remainder of World War I, optical lures became standard in British counter-sniper doctrine. They were refined, improved, adapted to different conditions. The Germans developed countermeasures. The British developed countermeasures, an escalating cycle that continued until armistice. In World War II, the technique was revived and modified for use against Japanese snipers in Pacific jungles, where different materials and placement strategies were required. In Korea, in Vietnam, in every conflict where snipers posed threats, versions of the optical lure were employed. Technology changed over decades. Lasers replaced reflected sunlight. Electronic sensors replaced human observers. But the underlying principle remained identical. A sniper who aims reveals himself. A reflection can provoke that aim. Once provoked, the sniper can be eliminated. Hargrove died in 1964, at age 71, of heart failure. His obituary in the Sheffield Telegraph was 4 sentences long, noting his birth, his military service, his employment, his survivors. There was no mention of innovation or tactical breakthroughs. His family buried him in a quiet churchyard, his grave marker bearing only name, dates, and the inscription, "He did his duty." The marker made no reference to broken spades or reflective patches or German snipers. It did not need to. The men who survived because of his innovation never knew his name, and he never sought their gratitude. He had seen a problem, devised a solution, implemented it with available tools. That was enough. The legacy of Hargrove's technique extended far beyond his individual contribution. In post-war reviews, the British Army analyzed tactical performance across thousands of engagements. The optical lure technique appeared in multiple reports, credited variously to different units and sectors. No single individual was identified as originator. The technique was treated as collective discovery, an emergent property of trench warfare rather than one man's work. This was not deliberate erasure, but the nature of institutional knowledge. Armies aggregate experiences, extract patterns, codify them into doctrine. Individual authorship is lost in that process. Hargrove became one of thousands whose small innovations collectively transformed how wars were fought. German military archives from the period contain references to new British counter-sniper techniques involving reflective devices, though descriptions are vague and contradictory. Some reports describe metal poles, others mention mirrors. Still others reference unexplained light flashes. The confusion was understandable because the technique was not uniform. Different units implemented it differently using whatever materials were available, adapting basic principles to local conditions. German countermeasures, anti-reflective scope coatings, revised operational procedures, pre-registered artillery on suspected marker locations, reduced technique effectiveness but imposed costs. Snipers with restricted firing hours operated at reduced capacity. Modified equipment was more expensive. Artillery diverted to suspected markers was unavailable for other targets. The innovation forced adaptation that consumed resources across the German sniper corps. By 1918, German intelligence had produced detailed analysis of British optical lure methods for distribution to frontline units. The document, discovered in captured files after the war, described the technique with remarkable accuracy, use of reflective surfaces to provoke scope flashes, typical placement patterns, times of optimal effectiveness. It recommended countermeasures and urged commanders to prioritize targets placing markers. What the document lacked was any acknowledgement that the technique originated with a single private armed with a broken spade. German analysts assumed such sophisticated methods must have been developed by specialists, tested in controlled conditions, implemented through official channels. The idea of improvisation by a mill worker in a muddy trench was inconceivable within German military thinking. The technique's influence extended beyond snipers. The principle of optical provocation to reveal hidden positions was adapted for other applications. Artillery observers used reflective panels to draw fire from concealed German batteries, allowing counter-battery targeting. Infantry used mirrors to simulate troop movements, provoking machine gun fire that revealed enemy positions. Aircraft employed variations using flares and reflective decoys to map air defenses. The broken spade marker catalyzed broader recognition of optics as a tactical dimension where light and reflection could be weaponized as effectively as bullets and shells. This recognition shaped interwar military technology development, influencing everything from camouflage design to infrared and radar systems. Hargrove, in quiet Sheffield retirement, knew nothing of this broader impact. He read newspapers, followed World War II with veterans' detached interest, but did not study military history or seek account of tactical innovations. He had no idea his method had been adopted, refined, expanded into a family of related techniques. He did not know that training manuals in multiple armies included optical counter-sniper tactics, or that military historians would identify World War I as a period when such tactics first emerged. His contribution had been absorbed into vast machinery of military knowledge, one small piece of a puzzle too large for any single person to comprehend. He had planted a broken spade, and from that act, doctrine had grown. But the connection between cause and effect, between man and method, had been severed completely. In decades after World War II, military historians began paying more attention to tactical innovation origins. Oral histories interviewed veterans, archival research uncovered forgotten reports, nuanced understanding of doctrinal evolution emerged. Some historians traced optical lore techniques to specific battles and sectors, but none traced them to Thomas Hargrove. His name appeared in no war diaries, casualty lists, commendation recommendations. He had been a private, an engineer, a man whose duties left no record beyond service number and discharge papers. Historians studying counter-sniper tactics assumed the technique developed collectively, representing cumulative wisdom of thousands rather than one individual's insight. They were not entirely wrong. Hargrove's idea had been adopted and modified by others, each iteration adding refinements, each implementation adapting principles to new circumstances. The technique in military manuals was not his creation alone, but the seed, the original spark, had been his, planted not in research facilities or staff colleges, but in a frozen trench by a man with a broken spade in memory of a friend who died for no reason. Hargrove's story illustrates fundamental truth about innovation. It often emerges from desperation rather than inspiration, from necessity rather than genius. He did not set out to revolutionize tactics. He set out to stop friend from dying. His solution was not elegant or sophisticated, but crude, improvised, built from scrap and half-remembered millwork principles. But it worked. In working, it demonstrated that innovation does not require laboratories, funding, or institutional support. It requires observation, analysis, willingness to act on ideas that contradict established procedures. Hargrove possessed these qualities not because he was exceptional, but because trench warfare circumstances demanded them. The Western Front was a crucible testing every man who entered, and survivors were those who adapted, learned, refused to accept that established methods were the only possible methods. This pattern, necessity driving innovation, individuals acting outside official channels, institutions later absorbing and claiming innovations, repeats throughout history. Hargrove's broken spade belongs to the same category as countless forgotten contributions. Soldiers improvising better drainage systems, medics developing faster triage procedures, mechanics modifying engines for better performance. These innovations are rarely documented. They spread through informal networks until they become indistinguishable from official doctrine. Individuals who created them fade into anonymity while institutions take credit. This is not malice, but the nature of large organizations that function by aggregating knowledge and distributing it broadly, stripping away individual authorship. The 14 German snipers eliminated in 20 minutes were not the story's end, but its beginning. Each sniper removed meant runners who survived, messages delivered, officers living to make decisions, engineers completing repairs. Each small survival cascaded forward, influencing events in ways impossible to fully trace. Perhaps one runner carried orders preventing a failed attack. Perhaps one officer devised strategy saving a battalion. Perhaps one engineer repaired communication lines allowing critical artillery support. The counterfactuals are endless. What is certain is that Hargrove's innovation altered his sector's war trajectory, and that alteration, however small, rippled outward, touching thousands of lives. His legacy was not recognition or fame, but the quiet persistence of an idea, the continuation of life that might have ended, the survival of knowledge refusing to die. Thomas Hargrove did his duty with a broken spade and scrap of polished tin, leaving a legacy that outlived him, spread across armies and decades, saved lives in wars he never saw. That is the truest remembrance.